Time to bring our specialist into the mega panel, an expert on Washington's budget crunch. Before we introduce him, though, one other scintillating bit of news on the debt today. According to a new article in New York Magazine on Peter Orszag, the former White House budget director apparently claims to have quit on principle, mad about Washington's refusal to get serious about the deficit. Our specialist today knows all about budget politics. David Stockman was budget director under President Ronald Reagan. And still with us from New York, Tim Carney of the Washington Examiner, Sam Seder, host of the Majority Report, and Jonathan Alter, MSNBC political analyst. David, let me start with you. I'm so glad that you're here as this budget insanity continues. I don't know if you were here earlier, but when I looked at the Paul Ryan plan, he has $5.7 trillion in debt over the next decade, about $14 trillion by my reckoning before he balances the budget sometime in the 2030s. Nothing done on the entitlements except for Medicaid in the next decade. This is not a serious plan, yet it's being hailed as courageous by half of the people who write on this for a living. What do you make of all this? Where are we?
Well, I agree with you. I think it's very disappointing. It's a nice plan for the fiscal afterlife if you have 10 or 20 years to wait. But if you look at the next 5 or 10 years, I think it ducks most of the big issues. If you want to address the deficit, there is a simple formula. It's RED, revenue, entitlements, defense, and discretionaries. He whiffs on 3 out of 4. It's not possible that we address this problem in the next decade without revenue increases, and yet the Ryan plan proposes to extend every single tax cut that we have right now, these temporary tax cuts that we can't afford, at a cost of $4 trillion over the next 10 years. The second, you have to address the big middle-class retirement entitlements, Social Security, Medicare. $17 trillion will be spent over the next 10 years on those, and he saves almost nothing, 0.2%. Defense is the third. He saves nothing over 10 years, in fact, adds to the baseline. So it's all left to take the money out of one small corner of the budget. It's not nearly enough. The plan is not viable either in terms of numbers and certainly in terms of getting any kind of majority. So I think it's very disappointing, and the only thing I can say is I'm waiting for what the White House has to say, but so far they've been even more disappointing. And if they argue tax cuts for the top or tax increases for the top 2% only, and that the middle class does not have to share in this burden, I think they'll be as far off base as the Ryan plan is.
Jonathan Alter, you've got a question for David Stockman.
Well, I just want to ask a historical question, David. You were famous in 1981 for saying we're facing an economic Dunkirk. And, you laid it all out for President Reagan when you were his budget director. And at that time, there wasn't any talk about revenue increases. It was all tax cuts. Now, you obviously have concluded that supply-side economics is a total failure and has been slam-dunked by history. Why does your political party, I'm assuming it is still your political party, continue to stick to what you call this religious connection to endless tax cuts?
Well, I think maybe it's because they're in a time warp, and I am a lapsed Republican. But in 1981, we had double-digit inflation. People were being driven up to very higher tax brackets very rapidly. Revenue was pushing 20% of GDP. It was a totally different set of issues. Today, revenue is at under 15% of GDP, the lowest level since the late 40s. We have taken a balance sheet that was pretty clean in 1980 and massively levered this economy, both public and private. Then we had $1 trillion of federal debt. Now we're at $14 trillion and setting up for this huge battle coming in a week or two.
How high do you think you can get revenue as a percentage of GDP? Historically, it's never gone above 20%. And no matter how high, when Kennedy had the rates that Sam loves so much, before Kennedy cut those, you couldn't get GDP over 20%. There's a limit to how much of the economy the government can take, and it seems to be dependent simply on the strength of the economy. So how far can your tax rates, your tax hikes take you in swallowing up the nation's wealth and giving it to Washington? Over 20, you think?
Yeah, I don't think there's any magic number, and at the end of the day, it is not a tax cut if it's financed with permanent deficit funding. In other words, that is only a deferral of tax increases that one day, sooner or later,
So you think
will
you
be
could
paid
get
down the road.
taxes up to 23% of GDP? You think the federal government could take that? Because that's what Obama's budget from earlier in the year forecast.
Of course it
not.
could. The answer is of course.
Okay,
Go
maybe
ahead.
it could. I wouldn't recommend that, but the point is there is $650 billion of temporary tax cuts expiring over the next few years. Most of those expirations should be allowed to occur. If they were, we would still have taxes under 20% of GDP, and we have to cut a lot of spending, too, because spending is at 24%
You're a
of
Democrat,
GDP.
David Stockman. You're sounding like a Democrat.
Well, we know.
Very interesting.
Let's get Sam Cedar in
We
with a
know
question.
if we were to go back to pre-Bush tax rates, we would cut the deficit in half tomorrow. But let me ask you this: I'm curious as to what is the real crisis that we're going through right now? I mean, does the debt and the deficit crisis really trump the fact that we have 8.8% unemployment in this country?
Yes, absolutely. I think the wolf is at the door. We have gotten away with this massive deficit financing for years now because most of the debt was being bought by the central banks. We're now at the point where the Fed is going to stop buying the debt in June. It's going to stop QE2, which is debt monetization. The Japanese are going to be selling U.S. treasuries, probably not buying them because of this massive crisis they have. And we saw this quarter that finally, for the first time in decades, China has a current account deficit, which means they won't be intervening in their markets as heavily buying debt. So we're going to face the real market. And what is the real market today for treasuries? The biggest bond fund in the world announced over the weekend, and that's PIMCO, that they're short the Treasury bond. This has never happened before to my knowledge, and I think it's an indication that this problem is coming at us very rapidly. It's not something for 10 or 20 or 30 years into the future. It's something for the next month, 2, and 3. It's here. The problem is...
We're going to have to leave it there for today, gentlemen. Thanks very much to David Stockman, our specialist. I would still hold out hope, by the way, for a combo Sam Cedar, David Stockman plan with short-term stimulus to address unemployment, but lock in by law today the long-term changes that we need to. Thanks also to John Alter and to Tim Carney. It's really goodbye now for you guys. So thanks again.